I'm here at Harvard University today, and I'm going to be asking Harvard students questions about equality and moral consideration and seeing what they think about whether or not we should include non-human animals into our circle of moral consideration as well. And so the first question I'm asking people is, do you think all humans should be granted kind of that same moral consideration?
So yeah, I think certainly everybody deserves some sort of equality.
Should we kind of consider all humans within our moral consideration and kind of grant a kind of a blanket equality to everyone to have the right to life?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And what is it about that humans that gives us that? What attributes do humans possess that mean that we should be granted a right to life?
Wow. Okay, that's a tough one.
I do think all humans should have a equal right to life and liberty and
And can you define what liberty means? Like, what does that mean to you?
To me, I think each human should kind of have the right to exercise some autonomy over their own life. And whether or not they choose to exercise that, I think is up to them. But I do think that everybody should have the right, so free from the coercion of poverty, like definitely from physical violence, economic violence, poverty, I guess. So.
And what attributes of being human do you think grants us those rights?
It's a really good question. I think being intelligent living beings, being a member of the same fabric of broad society, and being individuals who experience suffering, pain, joy, love.
I guess like a sentience, I suppose.
Yeah.
If I expand the question out and say we consider all humans in moral consideration, what about non-human animals? Should they be considered in our moral consideration as well?
Interesting. So I mean, I'm a vegetarian, and so I personally feel like a connection with animals and whatnot. Yeah. But I think it's tough because then when we choose life forms in general, like why do we draw the line in animals? And like we can think about the number of bacteria that our gut is killing every day, and like that's like I mean it seems like at some point we do end up drawing a line somewhere, and so I guess I'm not, even though I personally would have like a very tough time like killing an animal or thinking about harming animals, I'm not sure that I would be comfortable imposing that on others who have decided that the line lies closer to humanity than myself.
It's an interesting one. I guess the difference in bacteria would be like the sentience and consciousness, whereas I think for me the moral consideration of non-human animals is that our moral code dictates that humans should be granted consideration because they're we're conscious, sentient, have individualistic experiences of life, but then the animals that we exploit also have those same traits.
Fair enough, but I think sometimes, like for instance, we will suggest that animals, obviously animals have emotions and feelings, but like we are not able to experience those in the same way that we are able to maybe empathize with humanity. Right. So I think it makes it difficult when we're like talking about a starfish, for instance, like where is sentience there? Like I think it just the issue becomes a little bit more complicated. And I'm not saying I personally again feel like that line should be drawn maybe a little bit farther away, but I do think that we feel a solidarity with humanity that we don't with other species, and that's just the nature of like we feel solidarity with our family more than we feel with the rest of humanity. And those are maybe lines that we draw arbitrarily, but maybe
I guess that's the point, isn't it? It's like an arbitrary distinction between, and it makes sense for us to have closer alliances with our own species because it's easy, as you say, to empathize. But do you think that kind of lack of ability to empathize somewhat demotes the value of an animal's life or a non-human animal's life, or should they still be granted that right to life?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I think that I think it does. I think it makes it. I think maybe the project should be recognizing that it is arbitrary and making sure that we are okay with the decisions that we are making, the lines in the dirt that we're drawing. If they don't have any like specific moral backing, then we just have to be maybe aware of those and very conscious.
Okay, so if we branch the question out further and we say, outside of just the human context, what about, say, all non-human animals as well? Should they be granted some sort of notion of moral consideration?
Absolutely, yeah.
And why would you say absolutely?
Because, well, in the case of animals, it's very clear that animals have, they have desires, they have preferences, they take pleasure in certain things, they socialize, they find joy in their own lives and in their own activities, and so do we. So to deny, entities that experience life in much the same way that we do, the ability to live their lives the way that they want to, I think is not really defensible.
So I think that the way I think about it, I don't think that animals are humans, and so I don't.
No,
Yeah.
not that animals are humans, but that humans are maybe animals, or at least we exist within the animal kingdom.
Sure. So I think that humans have the responsibility to take care of animals. I think that out of the kind of beauty of humanity and creation, like if humanity is living rightly and in right relationship with each other, I think that flows, and I think that humanity will take care of the earth and its creation, and that includes animals. And so I think when things are rightly working, I think that animals are well taken care of and not exploited and not.
So could you define what taking care of means? So say for you and I in our day-to-day lives, what would it take for us to take care of animals?
I think that is not mistreating animals, right? So maltreatment. I think in terms of like animal abuse and those kind of things, I think that's like absolutely an exploitation and just a degradation of animals' dignity.
I guess their autonomy as well, right?
Their autonomy as well, I guess, in some ways, yeah.
What would be animal abuse? What would be like an example of that? Or what does the word abuse, how do you define that word?
I mean, I guess animal abuse, like as you think of like, I guess you see those commercials kind of on TV, like in the middle of the night, and, right. So like obviously like beating animals, that type of thing is obviously abusive. Depriving them of the things that they need to survive, that type of thing, yeah.
What about like the opposite of that? What about, say, when we take their life from them? Is that a form of abuse?
I think in some instances, yes. I don't think in all instances, but I do think in some instances, it definitely can be abusive, yeah.
Could you define like an instance where it wouldn't be an abuse to take the life of an animal?
I mean, I think different people obviously like fall on different places of the spectrum morally, right? I think there are circumstances in which like animals are, especially if you think of, like, are we considering fish animals?
Yeah.
So I mean, I think people could imagine circumstances in which fish are allowed to kind of free range wild fish, and are caught and people eat them.
Sure.
And I think I wouldn't consider that abuse, and I think there's a valid argument that that's not abusive.
What would that argument be, do you think? What would be we use the word moral. What would be the moral justification to consume animals or animal products?
I think the moral justification, that argument would probably be that to some extent, I think that animals could live full and I don't know, they could live lives free of like torture and free of abuse, and at the same time humans could consume them.
Right. So if we had like a big lush green pasture with cows like grazing, we would then be morally justified to take them to a slaughterhouse. Is that the general thinking?
I don't know. So I don't know.
And then so the next question, I kind of expand it a little bit further, and I say, well, what about, say, non-human animals? Do they deserve a sense of moral consideration as well?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think a lot of people think that there's kind of a correlation between intelligence and the possession of a soul, and they kind of link their answer with that. I don't know that I believe that.
Do you think that intelligence does define worth of life, or?
I don't think so.
No.
Yeah.
Do you think that there is a moral justification to exploit animals for food and clothing?
Yeah, I would say that. I don't know. I feel like that's a difficult question because I feel like we also we exploit. I don't know. I feel like I think it's tricky, and if you think about the meat industry or like cows, for instance, I feel like it's very terrible what we do to them. But at the same time, like I guess I'm imagining alternative options of cows have become so domesticated that their existence as a species has kind of devolved into being useful for humanity.
Right.
And I don't know. I mean, maybe maybe there are alternatives in which those distinctions don't exist. But I don't know. Yeah, I think that's a very tough question.
So could you maybe expand on what alternatives that would be?
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I guess I could envision a world, or at least the way that I choose to sort of envision relationships between humanity and animals is that we try our hardest to stay out of their way, and respect their autonomy. But I don't know. I mean, I don't even know how feasible it is. I mean, I've not done so much research in this, but I don't even know how feasible it is in the context of domesticated animals at this point. So, like,
Certainly.
if we just let them, if we stopped, mass producing them or whatever, what certainly like living in the wild is not really an option for them
Not for
anymore,
them,
right? So,
no.
and then I don't know. So I think it makes it difficult to especially the concept of evaluation. Like, how do we evaluate an animal's life as a human, as useful as a object for humans, and then how do we evaluate an animal's life and what that means, like if it's not, and
I guess to kind of understand whether an animal should be granted moral consideration is to work out whether they should be considered as an individual or as property. In the eyes of the law, they're considered as property, which creates a system where we can exploit them kind of rather freely.
Yeah.
But if we acknowledge them as being individuals as a someone, then the consideration behind the property aspect of it becomes a lot more difficult to justify. So I guess it's about perceptions. But okay, so let's say we do give them like really big, like we give them a lush life. Okay, these animals they live an amazing life.
Yeah.
But we still have to take that life from them. And so how do we kill them in a way that would be morally justified?
So yeah, again, this gets to, I don't know as much about farming or not farming.
Farming is,
but animal farming.
uses,
I guess yeah. So I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I do think that there is an argument for humans being able to kind of have some level of. I think humans have some level of dominion over animals, and I think that there is a way that exists that you can do that rightly, and you can do that without being abusive and exploitative.
But do you think? Okay, so let's say in a slaughterhouse. Okay.
Okay.
What happens to an animal in a slaughterhouse?
They're killed. I assume. I don't know.
They're killed. Yeah, I mean that's
yeah.
right. But I guess how are they killed? You're not like. Do you have any ideas of the methods?
I imagine it's a pretty bloody and kind of
By nature, I guess it is. Right?
Yeah.
So if they, let's say, cut their throats right in a slaughterhouse, when I say the word, like the phrase "we cut an animal's throat," do you think that objectively speaking that would be seen as a violent act?
I do think that's violent. Yeah.
Right. But then at the same time, how do we take the life of an animal from them in a way that isn't violent?
So I guess there are levels to the violence, right?
Levels to violence.
Yeah. I think that probably right when you think of maybe not hunting for sport, but I think in some, like for instance in some indigenous communities, like hunting as a source of food supply is something that has been historically done, and I don't think it's been. I think when it's done rightly, I think there's a respect for animals and for what they provide that allows you to do that without just.
Well, what about you and I, right? In a contemporary society, here we are in Cambridge, in the east coast of the US.
Right.
But I think we don't have that indigenous culture necessarily the same way as what we were describing.
Sure.
And so how do we then, when we have an abundance of options, how do we justify paying someone to cut the throat of an animal in that circumstance?
Sure. No, I mean, I do think that that's definitely something to take into consideration, right? I think that what I will say is I don't think that like hunting animals humanely I don't think that's entirely ancient. Like I think that probably exists today in ways that aren't inhumane. But I do think that it's important for us to be mindful of how we consume animals, why we consume them, how often.
Yeah.
And so I do think that that's absolutely something to be mindful of.
Yeah. What does the word humane mean?
humane.
Do we say like humane hunting or humane slaughter?
Yeah.
But we have to define what that word means
What
to
that
use
word
it.
means.
If I was to treat you humanely, what would you? I would be treating you in what manner?
I guess probably in the literal way, it's probably like as is rightful to treat another human. But I guess
That's where it derives from, the word human.
Sure.
But I guess synonyms would be like compassion, benevolence.
Right.
Do you think there's a compassionate or benevolent way to take the life of an animal if we don't have to?
I guess it's like a matter of personal opinion, right? Like I do think that there should absolutely be a level of compassion, like you said, with which we treat animals. I guess it's a matter of personal opinion. Like I think that there are ways that animals can, I don't know, that humans can, I don't know, consume them. I don't, like I said, I'm not as knowledgeable about the technical aspects of like slaughterhouses, right? Like I do think that there is a way, as far as I know, that animals are like held in these cages and slaughtered and injected with chemicals, and I think that is not befitting of their dignity.
Sure.
Right.
We value human life because we say, well, there's a sentience, there's an experience of suffering and pain, but also happiness and joy. Do you think that non-human animals are also capable of experiencing those same emotions and sensations?
I am not sure. I don't think I know enough, but I would say so.
Yeah. And so if we would say so, does that mean that we should grant non-human animals the same kind of moral consideration? And in terms of that, I mean like a right to a life.
By that logic, I would say yeah.
Yeah. And do you think that we are logically honest in that way? And do we grant animals a right to a life free from suffering and exploitation?
No, I don't think so, yeah.
See, that's quite, it seems like a bit of a loaded question, I guess.
Yeah.
So can you maybe name some examples in which we do take animals' lives in a way that would be unbefitting of our moral code?
Totally. Food, clothing, pretty much anything consumable that we use animals for, which is most things, yeah.
Seems that way. And so how do we morally justify using animals for, say, food or clothing?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to intelligence.
But intelligence doesn't define worth of life.
Right. It depends on who you ask, but I would say broadly, intelligence might be one of those things. The possession of a soul, I think, for a lot of people is a question that they factor into whether or not they consume animals or animal products.
Well, what about for you? What moral justification would you use?
Yeah.
Or do you use, should I say?
Yeah, I would say I just shy away probably from thinking about it too much, is probably what I personally use, and what most people would use is because we don't interface with animals in the same way that we interface with humans on a daily basis, we probably just don't ask those questions very often.
It's interesting. Yeah. I think so. We're very much disconnected from the process.
Yeah.
And do you think that there's kind of, if we were to think about what happens when we buy certain products, do you think that would make us feel, would that change our opinion of those products?
Yeah, I definitely think so. For example, my birthday was recently and we went out to dinner, and one of the things I was looking at getting had foie gras in it, and I was like, I don't know what that is, so I looked it up and I decided not to get it because I learned what they do to make foie gras. And so I think if when purchasing products or like meat or things like that, if we were constantly reminded of the process, that it probably, you would see a reduction in people buying those products.
That's a really valid point. Do you think that morally there's a difference between purchasing something like foie gras or a steak or a piece of cheese? Do you think morally there's a difference?
No, not really. And I think even above and beyond like the effect on the animal, there's broader considerations as well that could be used to get people to care, such as like environmental impact and things like that. So I think if you start to like pile on all of those different considerations, then you're likely to be able to achieve an outcome as far as like reducing people's like consuming of animals.
Absolutely. All about education and awareness, isn't it? Maybe today, just have a look and see what happens in a slaughterhouse. See if you think it's something that morally you subscribe to. See if it's something you think that is not abusive. And because it's all about education. And the more we know, the more we can empower to make informed decisions. So maybe just when you've got a bit of time later, just have a little Google and see what you find.
Do you have any suggestions?
I do, if you want it.
Yeah.
I can't promise they're pleasant, but I can happily write them down for you.
Let me know. Yeah.
Sure,
let me
okay.
know
Let me know. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you very
appreciate
much.
that.
I appreciate it.
Can I write on your phone or something?
Yeah.
That would be absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate the conversation.
No problem.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
there's a documentary called Dominion, which is,
Okay.
it ties in nicely to what we were chatting about. Actually,
Yeah, yeah.
there's also another documentary called Land of Hope and Glory, which is about
Land of Hope and Glory.
yeah,
Okay.
oh land, which
Oh,
Is
Land.
yeah,
Okay,
sorry, that's
okay.
my
No,
English
no, no.
accent, which is a UK documentary.
Okay.
But at the same time, it explores traditional farming practices. So those two I'd recommend.
Okay,
I mean,
cool.
if you want one about the environment, there's one called Cowspiracy, which is on Netflix.
Cowspiracy.
So,
Okay.
but yeah,
I'll check it out.
lovely
Okay.
to meet you.
I
Have a
appreciate
wonderful
it.
day.
Likewise.
Canada Goose is almost infamous for like the fur trim and stuff. And so I was wondering, when you bought the jacket, were you aware of it being like a real fur trim? Do you think that behavioural traits that from our ancestors should set a moral precedent for what we do today?